Welcome to Noisecutter.
And welcome to this episode of the Noisecutter podcast, a readout of a newsletter issue about the TikTok ban, the plans to build a pier in Gaza, and the ongoing crisis in Haiti. All right, let's get into it. So there's a ticking clock for TikTok. I feel like the point of reading books like Fahrenheit 451 in high school is to impress upon our young minds the danger of simply banning things just because they make us uncomfortable. But not banning stuff, though, is also a problem, right? Just ask Oregon about how well making fentanyl legal went. Here's a hint, it didn't go well. So what's the bad thing that we want to ban today, right? And it's TikTok. Or no, it's China. We're trying to sort of ban China from having access to U.S. social media data. Congress's efforts to ban TikTok are really better described as efforts to ensure that China's MSS, their Ministry of State Security, basically their CIA, doesn't A, have access to data associated with devices on which we've installed the TikTok app, and that's crucial there. That's about installing the app and the data that the app sends back. And B, we don't want them to have the ability to exert covert influence over us through content delivered to us via TikTok, right? And we'll get into what that means. So if you ask me, those are pretty important things. But this is Noisecutter, and things are just never that simple. So there's two separate sets of issues to consider here, right? One, whether TikTok actually does those things now, and whether it has the ability to do them in the future. And two, whether the proposed legislation would actually solve this problem. So let's start with the first. Does TikTok spy on people, or at least does it have the ability to spy on people? And it's sort of a complicated answer. So a think tank called Citizen Lab published a study in 2021 comparing TikTok with its China-focused cousin, Douyin. And they took a specific eye towards security, privacy, and censorship. Now, the study didn't uncover any overt spying or data theft on the part of TikTok, but it wasn't a complete exoneration of TikTok either. Now, what do I mean by this? Because while there wasn't evidence of spying going on, like right now, and I believe the study, which was from 21, holds up through today, whether TikTok could start spying on people at some time in the future is something about which the folks at Citizen Lab and others are less certain. The study notes, TikTok and Douyin's Android apps share many parts of their source code. We postulate that ByteDance develops TikTok and Douyin starting out from a common code base and applies different customizations according to market needs. We observe that some of these customizations can be turned on or off by different server-returned configuration values. We are concerned but could not confirm that this capability may be used to turn on privacy-violating hidden features. And, more directly, they write, we are concerned with the possibility where TikTok server-returned configuration values could enable those dormant code written for Douyin, which might lead to China-specific features being enabled. Wow. And that's just spying. What about the data that you willfully give TikTok, whether you realize it or not? There's a ton of value in that, too. And it includes things like, IP addresses, the contents of your DMs, your search history, your watch history, and so on. As far as location data goes, TikTok does collect it, but by their own admission, with some restrictions. Now, in the US, they claim not to collect and harvest precise phone GPS data. But a phone's GPS, typically what we think of when we think about location data generation, right? It isn't the only source of location data. As an article in Wired magazine points out, every time you create content on TikTok, whether or not you post it, so even your drafts, TikTok knows where and when that video was created. And also, right, by my estimation, using very off-the-shelf facial rec technology, TikTok could easily figure out who, like what your name is, who is in the video as well. Now, sort of bulk collection and analysis of this data would give the Chinese government insight into the lives of U.S. citizens that the U.S. government might not want China to have. And yet, do we have direct evidence that they're doing it? No. Right? But nevertheless, would it be reasonable for us to suspect that the Chinese MSS are doing that sort of bulk collection and analysis? Yeah. And it's important to note also that we're only able to see what's out in public, right? That is to say, we don't know, but lawmakers either already do know or are about to be briefed about what the intelligence community has been able to dig up around this threat. And whatever it is, it's been enough to make both sides of Congress, remarkably in this political climate, both sides of Congress uncomfortable enough to act. So, but what about the part about undue influence, right? That all has nothing to do with the type of content, or sorry, let me back that up. That has to do with the type of content that's promoted on the platform and served up to users per TikTok's content algorithm. So could that be manipulated to promote fake news and propaganda? Right? The answer is obviously yes. Russian hackers were able to mount a disinformation campaign on Facebook in the run-up to the 2016 election, and Russia didn't even control Facebook. With the capabilities that platform control has to offer, one might reasonably expect the effects to be even greater should China and its MSS mount a similar campaign. So what about the legislation, right? As currently drafted, it targets TikTok and ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, directly, but also creates a separate set of potential targets, that is to say, apps and app developers, that are, quote, foreign adversary controlled, and, quote, which is determined by the president to present a significant threat to the national security of the United States. And this would be after the president's issuance of a public notice and a report to Congress regarding that determination. So divestiture, right, selling off the app to another company, is an alternative to simply closing up shop. But the adequacy of the divestiture is also subject to the president's determination through an interagency process. So I can see why the ACLU is pissed about this, right? As drafted, the power does seem a little bit broad. I mean, basically, the president can make a determination that this foreign-controlled app presents a threat to national security, notify the public, notify Congress, and boom, they either they're banned or they have to sell. But I'm not so swayed by arguments around the First Amendment, right? Whether this is an appropriate use of executive power, that's a separate matter, right? But the First Amendment arguments, I don't really buy. The proposed regulation doesn't have anything to do with the actual contents of any speech posted to TikTok or anywhere else. Rather, it's about access. Excuse me. But here's the thing. No one's banning social media, right? Folks can still post their silly dance videos or whatever else it is that they post, on Instagram, YouTube with their new YouTube Shorts, Facebook, and any number of other social networks, which do roughly the same thing as TikTok. It's not as though TikTok provided a forum for folks otherwise without access to social media, right? It's not as though I can't download any other social media but TikTok. That's my saving access. And in terms of content, I'd venture a guess that there's more content out there that violates TikTok's terms of use and is thus censored or taken down by TikTok than Instagram's or YouTube's or any number of other video sharing platforms. So what's so unique about the way in which TikTok provides access then, right? I would venture to say nothing. But there is something different about TikTok versus seemingly all of the other social media platforms out there. And that's growth. So many folks on so many social media platforms are out there to grow their following. I mean, heck, so will we, right? It's those next 100 followers or 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever. And, for whatever reason, one reason being, for instance, a copious amount of bots and fake actors, fake accounts, TikTok seemed to grow people's follower counts faster and higher on average than any other platform. It provided, in larger proportions, that sense of gratification and validation that drives so much of social media posting. And whether it was fully real or just slightly real, it worked, right? You've got the same person on Instagram and their post gets 100 likes, but on TikTok it gets 10,000. It doesn't matter that, 9,900 of those likes might be fake, right? More is more. And that's why people love TikTok. So while the threat posed by TikTok might be, half nonsense, the real reason, if we're being honest, as to why we want to just chance it and let TikTok ride, is fully nonsense. But when that starts to mess with people's incomes, and here I'm talking about the pretty lucrative brand deals that influencers get from their, huge, perhaps inflated follower accounts on TikTok, when you start to mess with that, that's when the pitchforks come out. And color me old-fashioned, but I'm much more worried about national security than I am about influencers. And thankfully, it seems that Congress might agree. But we'll see where this goes. Next, we're on to the plan to build a pier in Gaza. So, in last week's State of the Union address, President Biden announced a U.S.-led operation to construct a pier in Gaza to facilitate humanitarian aid shipments to the region. He also did mention, however, that this wouldn't involve boots on the ground. And if you found that juxtaposition to be just a bit of a head-scratcher, you weren't alone. So what exactly are we talking about here? It's a whole segment of military operations called, quote, logistics over the shore, or LOTS for short. Now, if you're looking to go down a LOTS rabbit hole, you should start with the Army's history of logistics over the shore operations. I've linked it, like a lot of other mentions, in the actual text of this episode newsletter issue, which you can find at noisecutter.substack.com or noisecutter.com. And you can look up the operations referenced in the Army's history on Wikipedia, because the history is a bit concise. It's a trip I went on, and here's what I took away from it. The most impressive part of the U.S. Armed Services isn't their ability to destroy stuff, contrary to what you might think, but rather it's their ability to move a lot of stuff around the world quickly and precisely and overcoming a wide range of obstacles in the process. To me, it's a logistics powerhouse that sometimes gets into fights. But what's going to happen in Gaza, and in 60 days, no less? In simpler terms, the Army's going to construct a big floating causeway, like a roadway, and then ram it into a beachhead. And then boats full of relief supplies can make port on the floating end, unload onto trucks, and those trucks can bring the supplies on shore, distribute them, etc. But this is a Middle East conflict zone we're talking about, and nothing is ever going to be just that simple. Per the DoD, U.S. involvement will be limited to building the causeway, driving it into the ground, and bringing aid via ship to the floating end. But the bit about trucks receiving it, driving it onto shore, and distributing it, that'll be done by, quote, partners in the region, according to the DoD official statement. So that sounds ambitious, but vague, and that's why we've dug in. The biggest question here is security, right? Israel's main concern regarding aid distribution is that the aid intended for humanitarian purposes will be diverted by Hamas to its fighters still occupying parts of Gaza. That concern and Israel's actions around it are sort of why we're in this situation today. With, the US and our overgrown pool floaty. But to be fair, Israel's concerns aren't entirely unfounded. Israeli intelligence has presented fairly detailed allegations of individuals employed by, this is going to be a mouthful, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or the UNRWA, pronounced UNRWA for short, that are taking part. So, allegations of individuals employed by UNRWA taking part in the October 7th attacks and otherwise aiding Hamas. Given that UNRWA had been coordinating humanitarian aid shipments to Gaza, one might wonder if, A, that's at least partly how Hamas was able to smuggle in the quantity of arms that they were able to smuggle in, and B, whether UN aid was and or is being diverted to Hamas by actual Hamas operatives being employed by UNRWA. And as Andy Milburn pointed out in a recent episode of the Team House Eyes On podcast, link to it in the show notes, Hamas fighters aren't likely short of bullets right now, but they're short of food and water. The hard part of delivering aid to Palestinian civilians isn't getting it there, but rather making sure it goes where it's intended to go, to the civilians, to the refugees. And that's the part that, in our plan for this pier, we don't seem to have figured out yet. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds, right? Maritime security could become an issue, as the Houthis have demonstrated it doesn't take really all that much to attack ships in open water. And, President Biden has indicated that Israel will be providing security on the shore side of the floating causeway, but in a desperate situation with potentially disorganized distribution, and that's coupled with recent incidents involving IDF soldiers and Palestinian civilians seeking aid, the situation could easily spiral. Despite the White House's optimism, there's a lot to be wary of here, and this continues to be a space to watch as history unfolds. And finally, we're taking a look at Haiti. I'm going to try to keep this brief, though trying to briefly walk someone through even the very recent history of Haiti is a fool's errand. The TLDR is this, right? Haiti is a country that just cannot seem to catch a break. Back in 2010, Haiti was hit by a massive earthquake, which killed somewhere between 160,000 and 300,000 people and rendered an additional 1.6 million people homeless. And to put things into perspective, the population of Haiti today is roughly 11.5 million, right? So just about 10%. The earthquake was almost immediately followed, right, by an outbreak of cholera, which, may have been caused. All evidence reasonably seems to point to the cause being waste contamination emanating from a UN peacekeeper base. Great. Anthony Bourdain visited Haiti about a year later in 2011, and he captured, in his own way, the situation on the ground in the first episode of season 7 of his show, No Reservations. There's a link to it. You can stream it on Max. That's what I did very recently, and there's a bunch of other ways to watch it, but I highly recommend it. Bourdain manages to capture in a way that only he ever really could the rich culture and history of a country struggling to cope with a widespread humanitarian crisis. Government throughout this time was essentially a series of one kleptocrat being booted in favor of another. And a bizarre alliance system began between Haiti's political factions and various armed gangs. And of course, the gangs, many with, Haitian army and elite police unit veterans among their members, were engaged in bloody conflict against one another. And then in 2021, the Haitian president at the time was assassinated, and the country's current prime minister was considered as a suspect. Now, to date, those behind the assassination remain unknown. And for a deeper dive into this history, you should look no further than my friends Danny Gold and Sean Williams on an episode of their podcast, the Underworld podcast. And there's a link to it in the show notes here. But what we're looking at today with Haiti is the expected result of more than a decade of unrelenting political upheaval, economic strife, natural disasters, disease, starvation, violence, and inept efforts at mitigation by various governments and NGOs. The current Haitian Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, was most recently brokering a deal with Kenya, which would involve the African nation's police forces setting boots on the ground in Haiti to stem the gang violence and restore order. But Henri, whose legitimacy as head of government has been broadly challenged in Haiti since his assumption of power after the assassination of his predecessor, hasn't yet returned to Haiti from that trip, decamping instead to Puerto Rico. A former police officer called Jimmy Barbecue Cherzier has called for Henri's resignation and threatened, and I quote, a civil war that will lead to genocide should Henri return. The forces promised by Kenyan President William Ruto have also not yet turned up, owing likely in part to domestic political objections in Kenya. Meanwhile, as the violence continues to escalate, some diplomatic staff of the United Nations, Germany, and other nations have been evacuated from the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, while the U.S. State Department has acknowledged the deployment of additional U.S. personnel to bolster security at the still operational embassy. For the U.S., a crisis this close to home couldn't come at a worse time. With fraught situations in Ukraine, Gaza, and the Red Sea to manage, I can't believe that there's any appetite for an intervention into Haiti at this time. And of course, let's not forget about the debacle surrounding the U.S.'s actions with respect to the presidency of Aristide back in the early 2000s. But I do also think that the State Department, behind closed doors, may be discouraging Henri from returning. The consequences in terms of violence would undoubtedly be dire. And, particularly given the relatively vast manpower and armament available to the gangs, both in the capital and across the country. Yeah, sure, Haiti's a small country, but if this is not a situation I would expect 1,000 or even 2,000 Kenyan police officers, or even if they were light infantry masquerading as police officers, even 2,000 light infantry soldiers, tongue twister, this is not something I'd expect that they'd be able to handle. But so what's the alternative, right? Jimmy Cherzier is the new PM? Or, perhaps more realistically as dictator? I can't imagine that anyone besides, maybe South American drug traffickers would be in favor of that outcome. And caught in the crossfire of all this are millions of innocent civilians, failed by both their leaders and the international community at large since, perhaps Haiti's inception as a country. All we can do right now is wait and watch and maybe hope. It's a tough spot, and we will see how history unfolds here. But that is all for this issue of the Noisecutter Newsletter, recorded here as an episode of the Noisecutter Podcast. I'm your host, Rex Chatterjee, and until next time, I'll see you. The Noisecutter Podcast is a production of Titan Gray, LLC, and is hosted by me, Rex Chatterjee. If you found our podcast helpful and want to say thanks, please head over to your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever else, and give us a review, leave a comment, and hit that follow or subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest. For more about our guest or this episode, head over to our website, noisecutterpodcast.com, where you'll find contact info for our guest as well as links to some of the things we talked about on this episode. If you want to reach us directly, just send an email to info@noisecutterpodcast.com. This recording is a copyright of Titan Gray, LLC, with all rights reserved. This podcast may be construed as attorney advertising, and prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, and your listening to this podcast or contacting us about it does not form an attorney-client relationship. No affiliation or relationship, including an attorney-client relationship, exists between us and our guests unless otherwise stated. For full terms of use, please visit our website at noisecutterpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time, here at Noisecutter.